Let's get started. Hello, everyone. Good morning. Good morning from São Paulo. It's a bit of a cold day here in Brazil. We're facing winter coming through our door, but our heart is very warm to be with all of you today. I am Maria Clara Araújo. I
Maria
am the
Clara Araujo,
coordinator of Partnership with
and
Movements
I'm
at the
here with
Black
the Black
Feminist Fund,
Feminist Fund,
and I
and I
have the
am
joy
so
and
happy.
the pleasure and the opportunity as well as the privilege of being in this space and sharing this space with Black feminists that are so inspiring for all of us. And there are key figures for our series of political Black feminist politics, which was thought to be a platform that we could use as a fund to invite the movements that we work with and the movements that we support to share their own perspectives, their critiques, their worldviews, their knowledge on themes that are extremely relevant for the moment we're living. And it's precisely in this context that we think of the necessity and the responsibility of discussing about the increase in militarization. We are today focusing on the advancement of militarization in America and the Caribbean because we understand that our region has been the place for interventions in multiple forms, both in a macro political level as well as in a micro political level of our everyday interactions. I'm speaking from Brazil, a place that last year was the protagonist of a horrible scene in a community in the city of Rio de Janeiro, in the state of Rio de Janeiro, in which there was a slaughter of over 100 people, which is a state politic that is institutionalized and that is defended by political parties. So this is where we're speaking from for regions that are impacted by this increased militarization, but also from a region in which Black feminist movements are building and proposing alternatives in Colombia, in Brazil, in Haiti, in Trinidad and Tobago, in the US, in Honduras, in Guatemala, in Mexico. And so our debate today will bring and highlight these matters, not only the challenges, but I believe that overall the alternatives in our projects of world. I now have the pleasure of introducing and inviting our facilitator, Briche, so she can introduce herself and conduce our debate. So Briche Milborn was born and raised in Baltimore, Maryland, in the US. She's a leader in she has been a leader in philanthropy for over 10 years, and we have and had the pleasure of having Briche as one of our fellows in the Black Feminist Fund. Thank you for accepting our invitation, and let's get started.
Thank you so much, Maria Clara, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. My name is Briche Milburn and calling in from Brooklyn, New York today, where it's a little gloomy, but very happy to be here. As Maria Clara shared, I'm currently a consultant with Funders for a Just Economy and was a 2024-2025 Black Feminist Fund Fellow. I want to start by thanking the Black Feminist Fund for all the time and care that was put into planning and executing this series and this session. Also want to take the time to thank our speakers for sharing their time and expertise with us today. As we know, increased militarization in the Americas and the Caribbean continues to have devastating impacts on our communities. The unimaginable violence, displacement, and lack of accountability and erosion of rights and protections are ultimately contradictory to the liberatory future that we know Black feminists are seeking to build, which is why this conversation today is so urgent and so important. I'm going to begin by introducing our speakers and then inviting them to say a few words and introduce themselves. So starting off, we have Jessica Murillo Montaño, who is the director of the Mude Foundation. She works for the rights of women, Black communities, and on behalf of other challenging causes. She's a certified public accountant by profession and specializes in creative writing. with an Afro diasporic focus. Jessica?
Hello, good morning, and welcome to this conversation of militarization of logics and analysis. We will be here conversing, and on my behalf, I will present a posture, and we will see why the South Global has had a lot of militarization and the process of colonization. So, welcome, and we will start that conversation here. We will have that conversation here.
Thank you, Jessica. Next, we have Natalie Vilgrain, who is a Haitian Canadian feminist activist and co founder of Marjan, a community based feminist organization that's led by young people in Haiti. Her work sits at the intersection of governance, community development, and gender justice. And she supports organizations and communities in strengthening their capacities with a particular focus on adolescent, girls, women, and marginalized groups. Natalie?
Thank you, Bridge. Hi, everyone. My name is Natalie Bridge, and I'm a co-founder and general coordinator of Marijan. We are a young feminist organization based in Haiti. Thank you very much for being here with us today to have this conversation. Thank you, Bridge.
Thank you so much, Natalie. Next, we have Jamie Swift, who is the founder and executive director of Black Women Radicals, which is a Black feminist advocacy organization dedicated to uplifting and centering Black women and gender expansive peoples' activism in Africa and the African diaspora. Jamie is also the creator and founder of the School for Black Feminist Politics, and she's a political scientist. Jamie?
Good morning, everyone. I'm really honored to be here, and I'm really grateful that we're having this conversation, and I get to be in conversation with brilliant Black feminists who continue to do the work in spite of devastation. And I'm grateful to be here. So thank you.
Thanks so much. And last but not least, we have Sophia Marcia, who is the co-executive director of the Urgent Action Fund for Latin America and the Caribbean. She's an anti-racist feminist in her activism and work, and she studied engineering, holding a master's degree in rural development. She's been a member of the Political Ecology Research Group at the Latin American Council of Social Sciences and Humanities since 2016 and has recently contributed to research on gender and climate justice. Sophia?
Good morning. Welcome, Sofia Marcia. I'm in Honduras. I'm from Honduras, and I'm co-director for Latin America and the Caribbean. I'm so happy to share with colleagues that have been in other spaces and with whom we are allies and we're also accomplices. And I'm so happy that we can continue building here, complete working together. Thank you.
Thank you so much. All right, so let's get into this conversation. And just a reminder for all of our speakers, you all will have about 5 minutes to answer the question. And if you get a little close to that or go over, I'll have to step in and just wrap things up since we have a limited amount of time today. But we're going to start with Jessica. So, Jessica, in Colombia, as well as other countries from Latin America, we know that Black and Indigenous communities are the most impacted by state sponsored militarization and paramilitarization. The conflicts that come with this increased violence often mean persecution and displacement. I'm curious just to hear more about the manifestations of the and the impact of the militarization in the Americas and how Black feminist movements are responding to this injustice and these happenings.
Well, I have the honor to begin this panel. 5 minutes. I hope that it's enough. And if I go over, please let me know, cut me off. So they used to say that colonial violence has never disappeared. What it has done is allowed us to work on the post-colonial state. And based upon this, we have to talk about the South Global is object of militarization. This is something that is happening historically, how this exercise or how this movement is rooted on those territories due to what is happening and this power that in some way or another, let's say what pertains or what does not pertain, colonial legacy. And they said in micropolitics how the states start defining who lives and who doesn't. And based upon this, this shows, and there's a way of expression that has to do with what that this is something that is still occurring, and this becomes like a colonial legacy, like what is happening in Palestine and other countries and other places that are situated in this region. But we must also mention how this not only has brought forth conversation, has brought the mind frame to recognize these armed groups, and the state and nations have been the main perpetrators of militarization, and how the different powers, talking about Avia Ayala, we're also seeing how they introduced militarization from the wars, that the enemy was inside and not outside. This was from the time that we saw the Cold War, and then they start looking and their object is on specific people. So we can say that there are people that have been always targeted, and there is a behavior that is quite in particular that is related, but not only, that is happening in Africa, militarization based on fuel, oil industry, and we could also talk about what's happening in Colombia. And we also see mining and drug trafficking as is occurring in Colombia. So militarization is seen in different areas. We must mention things in particular, Black feminists, Black movements, not only Black movements, but everything that is happening that break that structure, not only Black people, and this implies that today we're talking about a mobilization that puts life in the center, and it lets us look at other horizon because we see a possibility and a hope to see a different world. And this allows us today to be have quilombos, palenques, and help us to mobilize life, putting everything in the center and looking at it from the political perspective, that after it's not only a narrative, but it becomes an exercise that gives us to look at a structure, a colonial structure that lets us see militarization as a solution, as it happened recently in Venezuela and United States, has 70 or 80 military in Avia Ayala, and this gives us a response of the exercise of control. It continues being an exercise that is materializing based on militarization. This is extremely key because Quijano, Franspano, as they said, based on the political independence, we were talking about liberty, but they insisted that something would stay and colonialism at the power. So it becomes the basis. Imperialism can decide who lives and who does not live in like territories like Avias Ayala. So to wrap up my reflection, what do I want to say today? That always that we talk about militarization, we must say the areas that are in war, but these entities have been those whom today are being mobilized in communities, and the exercise of putting life in the center, territories that today are being object militarization. What it does, it affects and causes different situations of occupancy, and they sell the politics of security. Looking at this, looking at it from militarization, which is something that is happening globally, this becomes very important because militarization shows us how important it can be, this follow up of everything that is occurring, militarization in territory, the sustainability, minerals, oil, and so forth. So I also want to say that militarization not only transforms in security, but it becomes a political project, colonial project that puts surveillance and also condemns to death certain people. It gives the type of oversight those that are still resisting. So the exercise of militarization and condemnation to death in the Black communities would not exist. And doing this exercise that is sustainable in time, how colonialism is still present today. But this has also been present from historic times. And today we can say that we're looking at life today as an exercise to stop criminalization and to stop death. Let us just remember trans fun also considered and brought to the table other conversation that says colonization to the power, and it could be sustained historically and today in what we see in the greatest powers and in the exercise of militarization, they're trying to sustain colonialism. This has also allowed everything that coexists, and not only from the Black perspective, but other perspectives as well. Because remember, those conversations about militarization, we must talk about the surveillance, also dissidents, maricas, and Black bodies. I will leave it here. And for now, I would
You.
like to say thank you.
Thank you so much, Jessica. Something that you said that really stuck out to me is this idea that imperialism gets to decide who lives and does not live. And I think that's something that continues to remind us how important this work is and why we need to be having these conversations because our communities' lives are at stake. So thank you so much for your comments there. Next, I will move on to Natalie. So, Natalie, while there is a history of strong anti imperialist movements in the Caribbean, the region has also been marked by complicity with foreign interventions. Given the varying stances on foreign intervention that exist among Caribbean states, as well as the language barriers across the region, how would you like to see Caribbean people build meaningful solidarity to address the increasing militarization in the region?
Thank you so much. I'm going to just remind us of everything that we are going through. The region, historically, it was militarized and used like a corridor, strategic corridor to advance certain agendas, military agendas and projects, imperialist projects. Therefore, it was a laboratory of security. So I wanted to say in the introduction that us as Black women, we live in this militarization because it's like it's a reduction in civic places, in surveillance that is increasing, surveillance increasing in and criminalization of social movements in certain countries. So I think that just like we've already said that it's very important. In Haiti, we have a very long history of resistance, of solidarity, and it's a big example of the measures where we've had missions, international missions, and also we've dependent a lot on the international security. So we see that the mode of operation has always been to destabilize and also to propose missions that are destabilizing. Therefore, we see that militarization has been shown as a security solution, but we have a lot of crisis, social crisis, political crisis. I'm also going to remind you as a young feminist, it's important to think how does this militarization has effect on us. For example, we had a Kenyan mission last year where we had organizations, feminist organizations, and also civil societies that did not want this Kenyan force in Haiti. But otherwise, we saw results and we saw also uh, sexual violence, and we also see survivors who probably would have not have access to justice. And I think that to respond to this question directly, it's very important to have a strong consolidation that exiges that we go beyond the barriers and we go beyond colonial barriers or geopolitical barriers that continue to confront us. So for me, it's very important that we create spaces where we exchange in the community because we're already doing it in our organizations. So as a young person, I think that it's important to do this work together collectively and to understand also in documenting and to transfer these problems and also transfer how this militarization has continued to make our lives suffer and also to make known to the generations. And I think that we cannot only we cannot only speak of security, but also surveillance, but also to see the whole question of justice, social justice, of health, and also of education. So I'm going to stop here. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Natalie. Yes, I completely agree that this idea around just having spaces for knowledge sharing and people to get together intergenerationally is really important for us to be able to continue, building these strong bonds to combat this growing militarization. And once again, everything that's completely the opposite of what the Black feminist worlds that we're trying to build. So really important for us to emphasize that knowledge sharing, the education, and having those intergenerational, intra-community spaces to continue to foster those relationships and that knowledge transfer. Next up, we have Jamie. So, Jamie, I'm curious to hear from you. Black feminists have always taken a very strong stance against imperialism, militarization, and state violence. And in the US, Black feminist movements have been a central voice in this particularly difficult moment, given the current administration's violations of rights both within and outside of the country. So I'd love to hear from you about the important role that Black feminist movements are playing globally in opposing the increased militarization of life.
Thank y'all so much. I wanted to say first, I'm grateful for this conversation because particularly at this current moment, we have a lot of, well, in my case, see and hear a lot of white leftists or white folks or people of color who are so concerned about this increased militarization. And I had to sit here and kind of not laugh almost, but Black folks, we've always have experienced militarization. We know what that means from enslavement to colonialization to imperialism. And militarization is not only the act of the military or the presence of the military, it's religious terrorism, it's climate change, it's cultural appropriation, it's pacification, right? It's environmental racism, it's surveillance, excuse me, as Jessica and Natalie spoke earlier, right, is the dispossession of indigenous people, right? We know all these things. And so I'm reminded of Langston Hughes, who said something about during his time period, people were throwing out the word authoritarianism and fascism. And he basically asked, what is fascism to the Negro? We've always known fascism, right? And we are seeing this legacy of militarization when we see the suppression of our movements, right? I keep going back to, I think about Zumbi dos Palmares. I think about Nanny of the Maroons. I think about the Palenques, as Jessica said earlier. You can see at every moment in time, these colonialists, these imperialists, the militarization, right, of our movements, they've always tried to suppress us, right? So we have this legacy of resistance, but we also know that militarization comes from and is rooted in slave patrols. And so I think about this in the context, particularly of the US and also in Brazil, where my research is in how these slave patrols originated, right, by these white men who were trying to, or the police originated from slave patrols, the military originated from slave patrols trying to police the bodily autonomy of enslaved Africans. And we also see how all of this imperialism and this violence and this militarization is connected. For example, after the US Civil War, we have the Confederates who lost in the South go to Brazil and migrate to Brazil, called the Confederados. So we see how white supremacy, they're always organized with each other, but we also have to recognize we've always been organized as well, right? And I think about Black feminist activist groups such as the Sojourners for Truth and Justice, right, who were organizing around militarization, right, and South African apartheid and lynchings in the US and violence against Black women. I think about the Third World Women's Alliance, who actually started off as a Black women's only organization coming out of the civil rights movement, but saw themselves as third world women in an alliance with other marginalized peoples around the world. And in my case, as a Black American woman, um, I take after what the Third World Women's Alliance stated, that even though Black people in the US, we deeply and intimately know what militarization is, we are in the belly of the beast. We're in the belly of US empire. So what does this mean for us, right? And what does this mean for our responsibility, not only to resist inside, inwardly, but also outwardly, right? And so I think about people like Angela Davis, I think about Undayi, I think about Margot Okazawa Ray, one of the founding members of the Combahee River Collective, who has been very passionate about, right, ending militarization and on the African continent and in Palestine. And so I guess I want to leave off with and to emphasize this, even though that our enemy is organized, right? We have always had this legacy, this cartography, this mapping, right, of our own resistance around the world, whether it be on the African continent, in the Caribbean, in Europe, in the United States, in the Americas, in the Caribbean. We have been doing this work and we will continue to do so. And I want to leave off from there's a speech by Audre Lorde called Sisterhood and Survival. And she did the speech in 1985. And I always ask these questions for myself, right, as a person who is resisting militarization here in the US and globally, because it's our responsibility and mandate. But Audre Lorde asks us this. She says, Sisterhood and survival demands that I ask myself, as an African American woman, what does it mean to be a citizen of the most powerful country on earth? And we are that. What does it mean to be a citizen of the country that stands upon the wrong side of every liberation struggle on this earth, right? And so I think that in my case, for me, I leave off with what is my responsibility to continue to grow and build Black feminist resistance. And it's political education, it's listening to other Black feminists, and it is to just be in true solidarity, right? And recognize that, once again, our enemy is strong, but we're stronger. So thank you so much.
Y'all are just dropping so many gems this morning, this afternoon, this evening. I want to just appreciate you for recognizing the fact that Black folks have always kind of been living under this threat of authoritarianism, fascism, increasing violence, et cetera. So thank you so much for naming that. It seems like there are so many other folks in the world who are kind of running around with their heads cut off. And it's just like, as you mentioned, we've been dealing with this in so many different ways since the beginning of time. So thank you so much for making that clear. And I guess I can take us into a different direction now by taking the next question to Sophia. So, Sophia, you co-lead a funding institution committed to supporting feminist movements, including Black feminists, that respond to crisis and deal with their repercussions. And fighting militarization is often one of the many reasons that Black feminists are being persecuted in their countries. I'd love to hear more from you about the kind of infrastructure and strategies that those activists need to be safe and what funders can do to ensure that we can have safe spaces for Black feminists and for this work to continue to be done in a way that actually will lead to the liberation of our people.
Exactly. I would like to say thank you. I want to start off thanking you for this spaces because it's the spaces, other than being powerful, together, bringing people from different parts of the world to talk about a topic that is very important and it impacts in great manner, and mainly whom are living in these areas, as I had mentioned previously. Well, I want to share with you first off, as activists and anti-racism projects that are working against militarization in the Caribbean, these are projects that are working against racism, and there's a leadership of women's incidency on gender and dissidents, and it's a universe that's building strategies to confront militarization, and that's how we have diverse responses. For this reason, infrastructures and strategies, there's a lot of diversity, and some of them, it looks like if they're unimaginable. And some infrastructures, it looks like they're coming from way back And at this current moment, they still continue being pertinent. So we look at groups like, for example, like the Palenques, and something that is very important to state as sponsors, we do not have the response, but those that have the response are those that are in the front line in the Caribbean and Latin America. These strategies should be supported and based upon trust on those that have the response and the best strategies. We can say that they're these, but those that can really say it are the strategies, the feminists, the movements that the leaders are Black women that are fighting against militarization and that also become infrastructures that work in the physical spaces and collective spaces and community spaces that have different projects that are being worked on, which is a project of death that comes from militarization. This can be physical, political strategies that become key for the different movement, strategies that work with communities that are spaces that allow to enjoy and sustain hope through dance, through songs. And these are spaces that assure that can become a refuge in the diverse situations of risk. And also, they have the community backing. These are strategies that are not only comprehensive. This type of infrastructure we have seen in Latin America and the Caribbean. Like, for example, Jessica is at the head of one of these organizations with a beautiful and powerful infrastructures with collective and community different projects. And we have seen in the Pacific Colombian, in Garifunas, in Honduras communities, and we also see health sustained by the care of emotional and physical care. There are spaces and infrastructure of the dance clubs that sustain ancestral culture and the cultural survival. So, something that I want to share with you, and something that I would like to highlight that we have seen as a fun, as an urgent, we have to defend the territories and the people that at this current moment are also fighting against the climate justice, the recovery of the ancestral territories that has always been part of the Black communities, and to confront militarization because they're also seeking to be in those spaces. Also, we are also seeing the disasters. We're also seeing one of the ways that we can work against this is also working. We have seen this in the Garifuna area, and we see what they're working on, the infrastructure that they're working on, their farms to sustain the community and the collectives. There are legal strategies that are also worked on, the communication that we're also having against hate. It's becoming very diverse in our role, the hate speech. And we're also looking in these spaces, those that are in charge, those that take care of financing. It's important to also emphasize on our role. And one of the things that we must do is to ensure that the organizations can work on their own strategies in a comprehensive manner. At this current moment, those that finance, we have to, the philanthropists, we have to be courageous. There's a situation of terror and a lot of fear if we put resources or not. But at this current moment, those that sponsor, we must be courageous and we must work on our structures to make sure that the voices of the communities and of the movement so that they can have visibility and that we can get closer and we can also know the diverse ways and strategies that we can work on those alliances and that these strategies and the communities and what they're already done, they can have the necessary resources on the long term. So I will stop right here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sophia. Much of what you said resonated. I think I'd just like to start with recognizing that you mentioned the importance of these spaces for folks to get together to practice care and healing. And I think that it's so important for funders to understand that these spaces are really important for activists to be able to continue to do their work and to not experience burnout and things of that nature. So thank you so much for highlighting that, as well as just recognizing that they need the resources to continue investing in these legal strategies, communications, combating hate speech, et cetera, and just having the resources so they can get the work done rather than continuing to fight for those resources. So thank you so much for doing that. So now we're going to move on to our second round of questions. And just a reminder for all of our visitors, please just put your questions in the chat or in the Q&A. And if we're able to get to them at the end of it, we certainly will. So continue to drop questions in the chat. Thank you. Now I will take it back to Jessica. So Jessica, across Latin America, Black feminists have been reclaiming the concept of buen vivir as an alternative to the increasing militarization of life. Last year, more than 300,000 people took part in the Black Women's March in Brazil. They called for buen vivir as a horizon for our collective future. Could you tell our audience a little bit more about why buen vivir is such an important principle for Black feminist movements in Latin America and why it must be embraced by everyone? Thank you.
Well, I want to say thank you. I'm going to initiate the talk about when we leave. It's a very important topic for the Black feminists and the criticism that implies that Black people are being questioned at all times. Buen vivir has been a term, indigenous term for communities, and it's very appropriate today for for the progression, how we progress, and looking at the term when we lead, it's also part in the political scenarios. It's problematic because there has always been a fear that when prohibir, there could be, and today we can see this, Correas, we saw this in Ecuador as constitutional. And this did not imply that as being part of the Constitution, there was not mining projects. And the same thing happened in Bolivia. So we understand that this type of projects really has not been done in the practice. So it's the criticism and the fear that many have to buen vivir, but there's also been criticism to the exercise of buen vivir in the sense that to talk about buen vivir, we have to have an economical and political structure must be built. So this will imply to have other conversation far and beyond the ancestral, and it would also imply to have other movements that would help us to work on this structurally. So this we have to have it present to talk about when we leave the the black communities, the black feminists. We have thought about so many different things that will allow us to have the cohesion between territories, communities, and the fact of being there and look at those possible worlds, those that already exist. But there's criticisms in regards to this, but it's far from white feminists that put at the center the topic of gender. So it's when we lead is going to leave violence based on gender as the only reality of those women of Black feminists. So this is something very important. When we lead is a different way to understand life, a different way to understand the earth, a different way to understand the communities. So this is a really different structure. Historically, when we did organizing communities, territories, it brings forward all the structure together, loaded with the thought that has to do with the politic insight. So looking at this from a different visual, this is colonial and talking about when we lead and looking at it, it has to be coherent. What they show us, the Black women have been working on this term and this praxis. In some occasions, we talk about Wendy as a philosophy, but it's a reality. It's something that is already embedded in the territories. We must recognize that the economical accumulation should not be looked at, the exploitation of the territories and also of bodies as well. And so looking at it from this perspective, Buen Vivir comes from the idea, the Occidental idea of progress and land grabbing. It comes from the idea of individualism, but it comes from the idea of competence to think as a community. Those moments that we have insisted on, that the defense of the territory is also the defense not only of bodies, but also of life, of the conditions that would allow that life can exist. So this is also important because Buen Vivir must also be related with those that live and those whom are present. There will not be this justice if there's not also climate justice as well. We must work in all the structures to talk about Buen Vivir. And this is one of the tasks that we have and those places and those inhabitants to come. So this should be the main reflection. And this is something that we should always bring to the table. How is it that we have a filtration of other ways to think?
Yes, we let escape the lack of documentation of the practices of Black people. They are appropriating those practices and treating them as formulas and appropriating them and introducing a centralized like regard to it, perspective to it. But we also have to understand that Black feminist movement, especially in the Abya Yala, Black women, Black people, I like to talk about Black people because it's not only about women, but Black people has made it possible to sustain the territories from the philosophy of the Buen Vivir. That's also linked to the Ubuntu and other philosophies. And so that exists due to Black people. The Buen Vivir is also a way of resisting militarization because they have sold us security as a key element of Buen Vivir. But militarization has contaminated that. And it's a contradiction, right? But that's a part of the same exercise of co-opting, a state co-opting indigenous ideologies. And we have to talk about this. It's important because this is another way of appropriation, of cultural appropriation that's weaponized towards, dispossession. Ecuador has done that. This is a practical exercise. The state introduces the buen vivir in the constitution, in the political constitution, right? And uh, um, they base their extractivism projects on the constitutional buen vivir. In fact, there is a project in the Abya Yala that was framed within Airbnb on how gentrification could develop the Abya Jala economy, but, starting from um, a concept of the buen vivir, which is a total contradiction. That's an oxymoron. So we should talk about how there are still colonized territories in Abya Yala. So we could say that Puerto Rico is one of those colonized territories. And that implies that we need to have conversations about how to how to address buen vivir in colonized territories. Black people talk about that, but Black people talk about that far from white perspectives and entered in the territories. My mom used to say that if you are aware of what's happening in your territories, you can deliberate. But because deliberation is external, then the buen vivir gets sort of like outsourced as well. So we need a political perspective, a political approach that allows us to get to understand what it means to assemble structures for the buen vivir. And it touches colonialism, uh, and it touches the buen vivir. And so uh, we also have to talk about bodies that still resist oppressive structures. The Marcha de las Mujeres Negras in Brazil, for instance, left us with a variety of reflections. So, for instance, there was a reflection about how do Black women talk about the Buen Vivir? What do we say when we talk about it as Black women? Because um, that will force us to have and like to sustain uncomfortable conversations because sometimes people don't consider that there should be like in short embodied perspectives. I could talk forever, excuse myself, but I think we need to have clarity. We need to think clearly because we are going through election processes. And like since last year with Francia Marquez's election, there has been this huge wave of very, very explicit racism. But that juncture has also elicited conversations about the Buen Vivir, but the Buen Vivir has also been co-opted by progressive, so-called progressive movements. And yes, this has led to constitutional transformations. However, that those the constitutional changes have also implied appropriation of indigenous and Black peoples like philosophies because that colonial state, I mean, the state has been shaped by colonization, and this coloniality of power condemns some bodies to death. And the coloniality of power co-opts the buen vivir and pretends to tell us what progress looks like for us. And so community, peoples from the communities, peasants, they have taken care of the territory of their lives from their philosophy of what other worlds or different worlds might be. We have to mention a lot of people, the Zapatistas and a lot of people, but by the end of the day, to we
Thank you
need
so
to
much,
stop them
Jessica, for
appropriating
thank you.
Jessica.
That was wonderful. And I appreciate you just highlighting that idea around our movements being co-opted. We've seen that so much throughout history, and we needed that reminder. So thank you so much for all that you shared there around the concept of buen vivir and just the importance of being conscious and aware of kind of the co-opting and all the different things that happen there, and the importance of just having that intersectional lens and centering Black women's experiences and Black feminists and Black people's experiences and all of that. And now we can move on to Natalie. So, Natalie, I am curious to hear from you. Haiti has experienced decades of militarized foreign interference, as has Cuba, and now the wider Caribbean is also facing US militarist violence in the Caribbean Sea. Could you talk a little bit more about how the Caribbean is positioned in the context of global militarization?
Actually, I listened to this and I was thinking about how important and it's very symbolic. Thank you so much for all the movements in Brazil for permitting us to take place in this historic space and movements. I think that in Caribbean, the Caribbean is in a strategic place in the militarization because this reality is usually invisible. Like I was explaining before, historically, this region has always been used as a place of geopolitical control and military control because in occupations and also military bases and also the uh, interventions, foreign interventions. Therefore, this space has always been considered as a zone being used and also in surveillance and control. Therefore, today, this logic continues in different forms. We see that when we see the migratory crisis and the traffic, sexual traffic, and the catastrophes in climate that we see right now, we see the response of military security and why it is being prioritized more than approaches that are centered on justice, on social justice. Therefore, I think that it's important to remember and to understand why this militarization, it's not touching only the regions in the same way and all the countries in the same way. For example, here in Haiti, we have a colonial heritage and a racial heritage, and there are certain territories and populations that are always menaced because we see it as people that are being menaced instead of being helped, and trying to project the question of solidarity in Haiti. Therefore, it's important that as a people, a Caribbean people, we don't stay isolated, that we don't stay only or utilize only a language barrier and political barrier, because it continues to fragment the region. Because we are a Francophone country, we don't have access to spaces that are political discussions and negotiations to certain powers. Therefore, as a Caribbean people, if we speak Spanish, English, or other languages, autochthon languages, we need to realize that we are united profoundly. And also, I would like to talk about solidarity in the region, because we cannot only talk about the freedom if we don't talk about the solidarity as a central point. Therefore, I think that as organizations and community organizations, social movements, syndical movements, or we need to construct responses that are collective amongst us. And it's why, as a center of feminists, we try to create spaces where we can create a link between Haiti and Caribbeans, so that we can fight against this militarization, so that this shows the context and the reality of what we are. And so I'm just gonna stop here. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And thank you again for emphasizing the importance of just working across those barriers and, not allowing the language barriers or the geographic barriers to kind of get in the way of working together and building progress across the region. Just definitely want to appreciate you for continuing to drive that home, because that is super important when we think about what it means to fight against this rising authoritarianism and militarization that's affecting all of these regions globally. Next, we have Jamie. So I'd love to hear from you, Jamie. Calling for transnational solidarity has become a central principle in the work of Black women radicals as an organization. Could you talk a little bit more about your learnings from this process? I'm curious to hear why it's so important to foster transnational solidarity between Black feminist movements right now. This is a good question after, hearing from Natalie talking about that importance of the solidarity. But I'm just curious to hear what emerged from that solidarity effort, and curious to hear from you why you think that's important.
Well, I thank you for that wonderful question. And I think if one is a student of Black feminisms, then we should be a student of our foremothers and our ancestors who had a transnational politic. I think about Toni Cade Bambara, brilliant author of The Salt Eaters and many others. And when she was asked about her identity as a Black American, she's like, no, I am a Black American, but my identity is of my people around the world, right? I'm a transnational Black feminist. When I think about June Jordan and her praxis of solidarity for not just folks in the United States, but also being of Caribbean American origin. What does that mean, right? To be in global solidarity, and also how she spoke out in solidarity for Palestine and became destitute because of it. Audre Lorde, her travels to Germany, her travels to New Zealand, her travels to Asia and all Pacific Island across, she had a transnational politic. And much of my work is inspired by them, but the work of Black male radicals is truly inspired by their legacies and lineages, but the concept and the practice of marronage, right? Going back to the maroon, I think this is so important as a political strategy against militarization. And I first became introduced to this concept of marronage, not only in the US, because we have maroons too, the Great Dismal Swamp, but really want to highlight Beatriz Nascimento and her interrogation of the Quilombo, right, as not just a historical static site of resistance, but that it lives in continuum in the Black body. And I think that is what we particularly need right now, is because in spite of militarization, in spite of the horrific things happening, we're seeing genocides happening in Sudan, Democratic Republic of the Congo. We see extrajudicial killings of Fisher people in Trinidad and Tobago. We see our Black leaders being co-opted and pacified, right? And accepting this behavior. And we voted for them to get in there, but look what they're betraying. They're betraying their political commitments. And so what does it mean to be in the praxis of the Quilombo or the praxis of the Maroon when we see militarization, when we see white supremacy, when we see anti-Blackness, not only trying to kill the Black body, but to kill the mind first? And I think the Quilombo, the Maroon, the Palenque, they remind us that of the radical imagination, right, of our ancestors. If Harriet Tubman, if Nanny of the Maroons, if all these different people could imagine a new world outside of enslavement, that is what we still need to hold on to today. And so I think about that in my work with Black male radicals, because I see all of our we may come from different regions, but I see our livelihoods as interconnected. And I also want to just mention a person who really radicalized me was Marielle Franco. And I remember where I was when she was assassinated. I was in Chicago at a conference actually talking about her work. And when the day before she was assassinated, she was at Casas das Pretas. And a colleague and friend of mine, Sherelle Barber, who is a Black feminist epidemiologist, right, who is from the Black South, and she spoke to Marielle, but wasn't able to speak in Brazilian Portuguese. But Marielle responded to her in English, quoting Audre Lorde, right? And so, what does this mean for us to converge in this way, right? In that, Marielle may not have been able to speak English and Sherelle not been able to speak Brazilian Portuguese, but we know about each other, right? And so I think the maroon is a political strategy of imagination and flight, but also fight, right? And so how do we learn our our differences, but recognize that we need each other more than our differences allow, right? And so I also wanted to mention that we talked about the Black Women's March in November of last year, and I was honored to be there in Brasilia to see these amazing Black feminists organize around Bem Viver, right? And so a few 4 years ago, in July 2022, I was the co-organizer of the second DFAM Black Women March in honor of Marielle Franco and Black feminisms in Latin America and the Caribbean, and that was held in Washington, D.C. And the way that people came out to really center Black feminisms in Latin America and the Caribbean, and also Marielle Franco, was one of the most profound sites for me of the maroon, of the Quilombo. And I just really think that we need to hold on to our imagination, because the radical Black feminist imagination, because I want to believe that there's a better world, but we have to hold on to this, because once they take this, they take everything else. And so I just, in the words of Marielle Franco, like, we are seeds, and we are still growing. And so I would like to end with that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So powerful. Yeah, we have to lead with our imagination. I love that you said that. And so grateful for spaces like the Black Feminist Fund that can bring us together across geographies, language barriers, et cetera. and do things like this that allow us to continue sharing knowledge, expertise, and getting to know one another and working together to be able to build that future that we want to see. So I'll close us out with Sophia for our last question before we get into our Q&A period. So Sophia, I'd love to hear from you. Most Black feminist movements that address crises tend to value collective care as a key practice for ensuring the well-being of those seeking to change the challenging context. Could you talk to our audience about, could you introduce to our audience, which includes funders, to this deeply political concept of care and why it must be a part of support for Black feminist movements?
Well, first of all, when we talk about collective care, we're not talking about anything new. We're not talking about anything that Black communities or different feminism and Black feminism is not doing right now. I mean, it is about it's all about the collective community strategies that have been going on, that the organizations have been putting in place. But organizations have also been a key to sustain the actions and the response to crisis, not only in a temporary manner, but in the long term. So as we have always seen that in the Black communities, it is important to say this because we here talking about care, but it's not new. And we have been this sort of like an emptiness of the word care, because we understand care as a part of these practices, but we understand care as a key element to make movement sustainable for justice, for reparation. Care is key for that justice. That is not the justice that we expect from states, but it's the justice that communities, Black communities and movements are already making possible. We know that these collective care strategies have been, have been existing since forever. Like, for instance, spiritual protection practices that communities put in place to face militarization and that have been working for centuries. We have also the healing spaces, the connection to the sea, the spiritual connection to the ancestors, the gatherings that guarantee the getting together towards the collective care. All of this is a part of what is key for movements when it comes to facing militarization. That's why it is so important that first, if these practices have existed from the past, it is important for us as funders to guarantee that resources, reach the movement so that they can continue, doing these actions. And sometimes funders do not understand, do not understand the concept of care. They do not understand why, organizations, need a budget for instance, traveling, for candles, for ceremonies. We need to get to know the movements and understanding deeply, the implications, the political implications of care, so that we can guarantee that movements can face militarization. We need to understand that facing militarization and care through care needs money. And so when we trust movements, we're still, courageous. We need to also understand that to crack the power dynamics. And we need to fund movements so that they can have the resources to work from care and through care. Also, founders, we need to understand that we do not replace the movement. We need to understand that collective care is not a recipe. We need to understand that care is a compilation of practices that existed from centuries ago. And like, we also need to work towards reparation justice. And that is a part of understanding our role as funders. We need to allocate resources to stop with the practices that make lives precarious, make lives in Black communities that face militarization precarious. And to guarantee that they can face militarization, we need to make sure that they have resources. And so we need to understand why they need resources for collective care, and that those resources get translated into health and other possibilities in Latin America and the Caribbean, and like Black communities are central to this. We see this in the Quilombo practices, for instance, and the gathering practices on the principle of Quilombo in Palenque. And so nowadays, those practices exist, those ancestral practices allow us to get together. Fantasías Negras is one of those practices. The Palenque Afectivo is one of those practices. It has gathered Black feminists from all of the continent for Black radical imagination, and that's an ancestral care practice that makes possible for movements and communities to face militarization and all of that, and those practices also sustain autonomy, and that's crucial in this context that we're living right now. And so mine is an invitation to funders, to the ones who have this role in philanthropy. It's an invitation to understand. It's an invitation to move a bit and understand what it means to sustain collective care practices in a context of militarization. I'm going to stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sophia. That was a great way to in this portion of the webinar. You all dropped so many gems today. I'm just thinking about some of the things that are sticking with me. Just one, this idea of really not letting these barriers prevent us from working together and working alongside each other, thinking about the fact that we have to really prioritize care and thinking about how funders need to understand it better, need to put more attention and focus into learning and understanding movements so that they can better support those movements and stop asking questions that groups continue to give them the same answers to as it relates to their needs as organizations. And once again, just thinking about the fact that as Black people, as Black feminists, we've been here before, even if the rest of the world kind of feels like this is totally new. This isn't necessarily new for us. So just wanting to call into that fact that we've been here before and we'll get through it as we have in the past. So thank you all for sharing your insights and expertise. And now we can get into some questions from the audience. These are some really juicy questions, so I'm going to read them and then have you all kind of just like write them down if you can, so you can make sure that you have all of the information in the question, and then you can answer whichever question really resonates with you. So the first question, how can we counter the how can we counter the current within Black America that sees what is happening by the US and Israel and Iran, Palestine, and to immigrants as not from us or by us, not our problem? In other words, I think this question is kind of asking, how do we get at the fact there is this sentiment amongst Black folks in America, maybe that the issues that are happening in Israel, Iran, Palestine, et cetera, and issues that immigrants are experiencing are not our problem? So that is the first question. The second question, coming from Brazil, do you believe that the fight for a new drug policy is an important step toward building democracy? I believe it is a strategy to increase the intensity of the war on drugs and is used to undermine particularly global South nations. The next question, why are we still organizing largely by nation state and colonial regions? What would make it possible to organize not just across borders, but beyond them? And lastly, if we have time, how can members of the Haitian diaspora and allies more broadly support international advocacy and be in solidarity with Haiti? I will leave whoever is interested in answering whichever of those questions to go ahead and get us started.
I knew y'all were gonna come with me with this first question. I knew it. I was waiting. Okay. I think this question about I guess like factions of Black folks in the United States not thinking that what's going on in Iran or Palestine, Lebanon, many other places is not our responsibility. I think that depends on which faction of Black America that you are speaking of, because we're all not the same. We all have different political ideologies, trajectories. Um, but I think for the Black people who have historically shown this, I mean, there's a long history of Black feminists who are in solidarity with Palestine. There are Afro Black Palestinians, there are Afro Black Lebanese people, there are Black people on all these areas, right? And I think the question is like we can focus on who's not attending to these things, but I think we should have focused on the history, particularly of Black feminists who have been in solidarity with these regions, right? In Black America. I keep, once again, June Jordan. I got to think about Audre Lorde. I got to think about Beverly Guy Sheftall. I have to think about Barbara Smith, Margot Okazawa Ray, Demita Frazier, right? The Third World Women's Alliance. I have to think about Shirley Graham Du Bois, who is an outspoken critic of um, the genocide in Palestine, but also Shirley Graham Du Bois and her husband, W.E.B. Du Bois, tried to come to Brazil, right, to learn more about the racial barrier, but was denied, right? So there are people who've had a long history and legacy, right, of doing this work. And I think we should focus on them. Because at some point, we are not going to be able to change the minds of certain people. That's the actual factual. But I think that we should focus on the we should be politically educated about who has come before us and who has been in solidarity so that those of us who are able to transform the hearts and minds of other people to see that our livelihood is connected to Israel because we pay taxes and that money goes to the militarization and the genocide of what's going on in Palestine. Iran, I just did an event with Afro-Iranian feminist by the name of Priscilla Konkoy Haveda and Lama Amin, who is an Afro-Lebanese feminist, talking about like how our tax dollars and our military is terrorizing people in Iran and Lebanon and Palestine, etc., right? And so I think that for me, the political strategy is focusing on who's done it before, building and even critiquing on their frameworks and connecting with those folks in those countries so that we don't be their voice, right? They can articulate their autonomy and self-determination for themselves.
Thank you so much. Jessica?
Hi, do you hear me? I'm going to focus a bit in the subject of provisions, understanding its colonial origin and understanding that it gets stronger in the 20th century because United States politics, and we also have to talk about the United Nations beyond saying slavery was, the biggest crime against humanity. Because the ONU has done anything, for instance, regarding Palestine or regarding all of the violence and dispossession that they have caused around the world. And I think it's important because we also have to talk about how this drug policy that emerges as a sanitary practice, but that is deeply moral and that determines um, at the end of the day, this sustains not only a geopolitical practice, but also a racial practice. It enforces that the drug politics are deeply enshrined in race politics. And we have to understand that the criminalization of certain substances has come together with the criminalization of the groups that produce them or that consume them. And that's very linked, deeply linked to the ways in which the United States looks at migration, Mexico or Colombia, for instance. No? So it is very important to get to question all of the terminologies that we use. But however, provisions, and assistance, all of that is linked to migration, to territories, and that has made that people are morally stigmatized. The criminalization has been enforced the support of the United Nations, right? Because that all of that comes from a colonial mentality that looks towards the um, sustainment of a colonial project, and that to date it has deeply impacted the militarization of territories. Black people do not talk about drug policy. We talk about war, like war on drugs, because it's deeply tied to the coloniality of power, and it's deeply linked to the dispossession and the forced displacement of Black communities. It also comes hand in hand with the dispossession of small producers, of small farmers, and it's deeply tied to an oppressive like structure. We need to keep that in mind. We need to keep in mind that this makes possible the international intervention. And international intervention today sustains capital in a radical way. So, in fact, many military bases that exist in our countries are sustained by the idea of assistantship, of this colonial idea of the drug prohibition, right? And we refer to it as foreign policy. We need to know, we need to name that as drug on wars. This is very war on drugs, because this war stigmatizes consumers and producers, but doesn't get deep in the exercise. And that makes it possible to the global north to define who is a consumer and who is a producer. On the other hand, the South puts, the dead bodies, the prisons, but the North has determined who produce and who's producing and who's consuming, and they promote the drug policies. And so the United States promoting a drug policy alongside with the United Nations, we need to call that war on drugs. The North just defines who produces and who doesn't. And the South keeps putting, the territories and the prisons and the deaths. And this is deeply linked to what's happening with ICE. And it has to do with youth, with peripheral populations, with peasants, with territories. In fact, in Colombia, we talk about drug mules. We talk about bodies that are being used for trafficking and for mercantilization of cocaine and other stuff, for commercialization. And it's very important to point that out, because what's Colombia in that situation? I'm not going to defend this territory in terms of productions and stuff, but I have something to say. And is that as long as you're situated in Colombia, you end up being a surveillance dispositive. Traveling outside Colombia, even within Colombia, implies that you are questioned, that you are scrutinized, because the big countries, the global north, that imposes perspectives on drug politics, and they stigmatize and they mark and they condemn bodies that come from those territories. It happens with Mexico, and it happens with Colombia, and it happens with the global south. You also have to talk about Abya Yala. That's important. That's crucial. That's pivotal. And we also need to talk about things that are impacted by this. And we have to talk about how this profiling impacts queer people, Black people, because these Black people, queer people, poor people are marked as producers, as consumers. And the economies that profit from this put in place institutions like ICE. So, and institutions like ICE, deliver the message that they are controlling, that they are, exercising power. I think the reflection goes beyond that. Call me cheesy if you want that, but we need to get to radical love, to Black radical love. That's what we have to do. Loving Black people is what we have to do. that has to come across all of the ways in which we organize. We've had many organizations, ELEX and other organizations, talk about criminalization surrounding drugs. But as long as we don't have the conviction and the clarity in the fact that all of this is a colonial exercise, and that it's entered in institutions like the United Nations, for instance, we want to understand that power is sustained by coloniality. Before questioning the United Nations, we have to understand it. We have to understand why Black peoples are condemned and how the United Nations have promoted incarceration. All of that is their responsibility. So Abya Yala is condemned by this assistantship, but this coloniality of power that is promoted by the so-called developed countries. And when we talked about the buen vivir does not only touch our bodies, it touches everything we inhabit and everything that inhabits us. We have to talk about eyes, and we have to talk about all of those institutions, because we think that Europe is talking against the genocide in Palestine, but they're doing collateral damage at the same time. And so, well, we need to have clarity regarding all of this, but the best we're doing is, palenques, quilombos, terangas, Black radical love,
Thank you
Black
so
love is
much, Jessica.
radical.
We want to pass it to Sophia and Natalie now for just some final thoughts or to answer any of the other questions. Thank you so much, Jessica. And then after Sophia and Natalie are done, we'll be able to wrap up. So I'd love to hear just some final thoughts from you two or answers to the other questions that were asked.
Thank you. I'm going to talk about the question of solidarity that they've asked, because it's very important. How can it sustain certain causes? Was that the question? I think that's what I understood. I had a conversation in Australia with a militant, and we asked ourselves how us in Caribbeans we can stay in solidarity with causes, with everything that's happening in Palestine and Sudan and other regions that are in crisis. And there is something that was said that reminded me that of the importance of helping, but it's also important to educate ourselves and understand the realities, social realities, political realities that are surrounding all these countries. So I think also before taking a position as militants, we need to understand these realities to be able to work, because we cannot speak without understanding how these populations are living in this crisis. I also think that it's a position that I find myself a lot, and I hear the Canadian government saying, I ask myself how can we invest our taxes, and what are the consequences of foreign politics on certain populations and certain regions. I think that it's important to continue to create spaces of talking and exchanging as young militants to try to create other realities that make sense for us. So I think that we need to continue to organize ourselves in communities, for example, as we do it against realities, and also to contribute concretely in social problems. And it can also help to give resources, maybe in the BFF or other organizations that work in this way. When I hear about solidarity, when I think about this question, for me, I think there are those four things that come in my mind. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And then, Sophia, I hate to give you like a little 30-second time slot, but if you could just give us your final thoughts really quickly, and we'll be able to wrap up.
Yes, thank you so much. First of all, I need to say that I feel very honored to listen to all of you, and I think it's very important uh, that well, I only have 20 seconds, but I need to underscore that the people who are in the territories in the Caribbean, in Latin America, in Black communities around the world, they've always had the solutions. I think it's very important to know that. Where are our references? That's important. Where are we putting our references when we think of solutions? And even for funders, when we think about what's the most like courageous way of sustaining movements, well, the most courageous way of doing it is being near them, being working with them, giving autonomy back, because Black communities have always told us about solutions that go beyond states, that go beyond, oh, what do we do with such a big enemy like, drug trafficking? What do we do about it? About this enemy that, is menacing our bodies and our communities? And particularly in the global south, I want to bring Caribbean, I want to bring Haiti to the discussion, because those are key references in thinking solutions to face crisis. They are telling us that it is important to fund global, local responses, and we need to value their solutions, because their solutions have always been legit, and Black love, and solutions that stem from the youth and binational gatherings, for instance, the ones that Natalie told us about. uh, those things are important. Those are crucial, that international solidarity must be put on the table. And we also need to remind ourselves that not everything is about money. It's also about, partnerships and networks and communication, and, empower platforms, and etc. And I want to wrap up with this. Thank you so much, everyone.
You. This has been such a wonderful conversation. You all are so amazing, and we're so grateful for your time and expertise today. Thank you to the Black Feminist Fund. Thank you to all of you for attending, and I can pass it to Maria for any final closing statement.
Now, thank you, Bree Chain. Everyone, let's show a lot of love for Bree Chain and for our speakers for this amazing webinar. So please share with hearts, applauses, the reactions you feel like. What an amazing discussion. We could spend all day speaking of all of that. We were even joking at the chat. Jessica deserves a webinar all to herself because there's a lot to be said. And so that was an amazing experience to be with all of you in this morning, in this afternoon, at this night. I want to thank Friche for accepting our invitation to facilitate our debate. I want to thank Jamie, Jessica, Natalie, and Sophia for accepting the challenge of having this debate as well. I want to thank our team of interpretation. We spoke so much about overcoming geographic and language barriers, and that is only possible because we have a team of interpretation here, Black people, Black women who are helping us overcome these barriers. So I want to thank the team of the Black Feminist Fund as well as all of you who stayed with us to the very end and who engaged so much with our debate. I want to invite you to answer to our survey as soon as this webinar is over. And I want to invite you back to watch our next session of the politics series from the Black Feminist Fund that will probably happen in the next 2 months. Thank you. Bye.